Hi, my name is Tania Roa. I work for Biodiversity for Livable Climate, and I'm here interviewing the wonderful Dr. Arian. She is working at Kachana Station in Kimberley, Western Australia. She's working in the research portion and seeing what amazing benefits these wild donkeys are bringing to the area. So as part of our campaign, we want to just spread more awareness on what is happening, why anyone outside of Australia can help, and more about wildlife in general. So that was my weak introduction to the situation and Dr. Arian. Please introduce yourself, your work, what brought you to Kachana Station, and anything else you think is important.
Thank you. And I think this campaign is really special and really important. It's it's certainly the first campaign that I have come across where the animals that we are trying to protect are wild donkeys. Not many people know that donkeys, that many donkeys are actually wild animals. And there's something about donkeys that kind of messes with our minds. It's like a wild donkey sounds to many people like a contradiction in terms. I started off, I suppose, as a kind of traditional conservation biologist and ecologist for many years. And I moved to Australia about 15 years ago, and I became very interested in the glorious feral animals that have been thriving across this island, whether it's wild donkeys, wild horses, wild camels, and I, through the research I was doing at the University of Technology, Sydney, we have a center there called the Center for Compassionate Conservation. The goal of our work was to essentially rethink what is conservation all about? Like, what would happen if we were to consider the donkeys like those on Kachana Station as wild animals that we should be protecting? Because at the moment, many wild animals are considered alien invaders that should be suppressed, controlled, and eradicated in order to protect pure nature. The kinds of ideas that underlie that particular ideology, and it is an ideology, just like the view that we should value all wild animals is an ideology. So underlying that ideology, then we then create science and policy. So if we change the ideology, as certainly I have done with myself, the kind of science that I've ended up doing has changed. My understanding about the world has changed. And I can certainly say that if we accept wild donkeys as the wild animals that they are, we discover that the world is a much more thriving, exciting, fantastic place than we tend to think that it is.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm so glad you brought up that term, alien invaders. We really have created these categories for so many different animals that vilifies them. And that kind of brings me to my next question. When we were introduced to each other by Judy Schwartz, the journalist on Biodiversity for Livable Climate's board, she mentioned that your expertise is in vilified wildlife. What brought you to this category, if you will, to this realm of conservation? And yeah, what does that term mean to you, vilified wildlife? It's a heavy connotation.
When I was, I suppose, a young conservation biologist, or growing up as a conservation biologist, I'm not originally from Australia. My views on conservation were formed in the culture where I was born, which is in Israel. And in Israel, conservation was primarily about how do we protect these, we called them open areas, so like forests and grasslands and deserts, and from human development. So it was this I suppose, a kind of more typical Lord of the Rings story, where the conservationists are the elves that are protecting the forests, and the orcs are the industrial revolution. And that's how I understood conservation, in those kinds of terms. Then when I moved to Australia, I suddenly discovered a different conservation culture in which, unlike Israel, which has a very high human population density, Australia has these amazing wide open spaces, and relative to its size has a very low human population density. That's why I wanted to live here. But what I found instead is that although Australia perhaps is a little bit less, or there's less of a concern about the like urban sprawl per se, the big concern in Australia is with animals that have deemed to be invasive species. And the entire conservation story in Australia, or the vast majority of it, is around the idea of good wildlife and bad wildlife. The bad wildlife were brought by the white man that came with the European colonizers to this place, and then they killed off all of the endemic native species that were unique to this landscape. And at first I assumed that story was probably made sense. And I didn't question it in particular. But I've been here now for, 15 years or so. I did my PhD here on these species and on their ecologies. And I came to develop a very different view about what it means, what these species have actually done ecologically, about what kind of effect it has when we try to control nature in order to protect nature. And I came to the worldview that really what I can contribute in this part of the world is to understand that what we can do as conservationists is help people be good friends to whatever wild animals, whatever creatures, domestic, whatever we call them, to all beings that we are surrounded with. And be very careful about becoming too religious with our categorizations of whether they belong to a particular species or a particular place or whatever definition, whether we call them wild or not. These definitions can be weaponized in very similar ways that we have always weaponized ideas against others for a variety of reasons.
That's powerful. That's a great story, and thank you for sharing that, how you came from Israel to Australia. I wasn't aware. But yeah, that's a drastic difference, and of course all wildlife lovers. I visited Australia a while ago. I love wildlife and I want to go back so bad because it is just a magical place. So that's also why I'm glad we are working on this campaign. Although we are based mostly in the US, I'm glad that we are working on this. And it may seem strange to our fellow American supporters why of all campaigns we decided to do this one. So to kind of give them more context, why do you think in particular this wild donkey herd in the Kimberley on Kachana Station, and maybe wild donkeys in Western Australia as a whole, why are they so important to the ecosystem, to the landscape?
I think a campaign to protect specifically the wild donkeys in Kachana can be extremely powerful, not just for donkeys there, not just for donkeys in Australia, not just for donkeys globally, but for many, many, many species. Kachana is a very, very unusual and special place because it is the only place left in that part of the world which is absolutely perfect wild donkey habitat, where donkeys are protected, and the custodians of that landscape, which you can only reach with a helicopter. It's an absolutely beautiful part of the world. And there used to be wild donkeys all through the region that is called the Kimberley. And these are the very, very last ones. And the problem is that there are no, your typical conservationists are not going to be acting on behalf of this extinction event. They don't even consider it to be an extinction because they don't consider the wild donkeys to be wildlife in the first place. But what we can, if we think about this a little bit differently, wild donkeys are, there's essentially no difference between a wild donkey and their ancestor, which is a species called the African wild ass. The African wild ass is a critically endangered species. There's about maybe 200 left in the wild around like Ethiopia. The domestic donkey is the offspring of the African wild ass. And the feral donkey or the wild donkey has simply reverted back to being the African wild ass. So what has happened with these donkeys is that in the area where they are considered native, they've become extremely endangered. They may go extinct quickly if conservation efforts are unsuccessful. And this is in a part of the world where conservation efforts would be extremely difficult. And yet they have flourished mainly in two parts of the world, in the United States and in Australia. And Australia has the largest part of the wild donkeys global range is now in Australia. And within Australia, the Kimberley is like one of the best places for wild donkeys. So essentially, we've got one of the biggest rewilding events to ever happen in the world, where a species that is virtually extinct is flourishing elsewhere, part in the United States, but primarily in Australia, and is now being driven extinct for conservation. Although in the Kimberley, it's a combination of it's for conservation and for the production of meat for the livestock industry. The Kimberley is a big livestock producer, primarily for the live export industry. Some listeners will be familiar with what that means. So essentially, all cattle that are produced in the Kimberley go to onto live export ships. And the killing of donkeys is done in order to promote that industry, but also is done in order to purify the land of this invasive species. So they are completely unprotected by anyone. And if we have, like, for example, the animal rights movement, well, the animal rights movement that cares about all animals, they tend to focus most of their attention on domestic animals. So if it comes to donkeys, animal rights organizations may focus quite a bit on domestic donkeys, so donkeys that are living with human beings. So no one is helping these wild donkeys. We've got the conservationists don't care about them, and in fact, they want them to go extinct. The meat industry has essentially no use for them, although now they're talking about using wild donkeys to supply products for the Chinese medicine industry. There's a product called Ejiao that is made out of donkey skins, which is another horrifying story. And the animal protection, animal rights movement tends not to notice wild animals because they think that the conservationists are looking after them, but they're not. So what we need is a completely new kind of movement where we're paying attention to species that have just been left in the dark. And these wild donkeys are exactly that. And they are so beautiful. And that area is so beautiful. And what they are going to be subjected to if we fail to protect them, it is just too horrendous to even contemplate.
Well, thank you for that background. Yeah, we tend to think of extinct there, right? If the African wild ass is from Africa, then it goes extinct there. And if it goes somewhere else, it doesn't really correlate. And so thank you for bringing that up. I mean, I know we tend to, especially in conservation, but it's becoming more mainstream now as we talk about biodiversity more openly. We tend to categorize native and non-native is almost automatically associated with invasive, but there really is not a direct correlation between those two, as you pointed out. I mean, these donkeys are benefiting the ecosystem through digging wells and providing those wells for other wildlife, and which create nurseries for the plants. Is there anything else in particular that these donkeys really, I mean, as you mentioned, only these donkeys go out there. This is really like their home. This is where they've been for so long, and cattle can't go there. It's just so far off, and it's not their preferred landscape. So yeah, if we didn't have these donkeys, as you mentioned, then no one would be out there grazing, and this landscape would look, I'm assuming, very brown. What would it look like if the donkeys are not there?
I've been to the Kimberley now 3 times on field trips, and every single time I've gone there. So in order to get to Kachana, you have to there's no roads, as I said. You have to go there by aircraft. So usually a helicopter or a fixed aircraft, fixed wing. Whenever I've flown there or flown out of there, I've seen fires. And I asked one of the pilots, how often in the year is the Kimberley on fire? And he said, the Kimberley is always on fire. There's always a fire somewhere in the Kimberley. And the research that me and my colleagues have started to do out there was to ask the question, well, are these donkeys that are, like you said, they're going into habitat that cattle do not. They are doing the stuff that megafauna, that large herbivores do. They trample, they eat vegetation, they break vegetation, they trample it into the soil, they fertilize the soil. How is that then going to influence fire? And the owner of custodians of Kachana they're essentially relying on these donkeys in combination with the domestic cows that they call their workers to regenerate the soils, to suppress fire, and to promote plant life and biodiversity. And that may sound strange, right? That people may think that herbivores are the enemies of plants, but they are not. Ecosystems are incredibly complex, interwoven things, living beings, in which there is a huge amount of mutualism and symbiosis and interdependency. And it's important to bear in mind that even though it may sound strange to think about Australia as needing wild donkeys, Australia used to be full of huge beasts, just like donkeys, but they went extinct about up to about 20,000 years ago. So in the late Pleistocene, everyone knows about the mammoths and the saber-toothed cats. And well, Australia used to have giant wombats, for example, and other huge creatures like carnivorous kangaroos and all sorts of creatures that went extinct between about 20 to 40,000 years ago. And these wild donkeys are playing similar roles in the ecosystem to what we understand that these extinct giant beasts used to provide. And the reason why probably these creatures went extinct is that they were hunted to extinction, as they were in North America and in other parts of the world. So wherever humans went, wherever humans moved to, the biggest animals went extinct. And now what we're having is this kind of resurgence of megafauna, megafauna as in huge animals, and they're bringing back the kinds of ecological functions that once used to be very common across the world. So that is part of what we're trying to learn about and find out, but this is all very, very new to find out what they do, because the only interest, I hope the wind isn't too bad, the only interest that has been in these animals is how to kill them. And I think I will move a little bit. And do you have a lot of wind noise, or is it okay?
It's okay when you talk. I think when you talk, it focuses on your voice. So
okay, so I'll just stay. Just suddenly, a gust of wind just came through.
Mother Nature, we love her. She's always coming in. It's actually okay timing because, I mean, it's just so much good information. I wanted to kind of give you a chance to wrap it up into a little bow, if we could, with a final message, if you will. I mean, to reiterate, you really did emphasize, and I completely agree, that we need to look at these ecosystems as a whole, and as with an understanding that they're so mysterious, there's so much we don't know about them yet. And just because these donkeys weren't there so many years ago doesn't mean that they don't belong there now. We are changing the earth, and we can't expect it to go back to how it was before we damaged it. Really, we have to kind of work with the punches and see what animals are helping us do that, and these donkeys are. But yeah, just to wrap things up, I really wanted to give you a chance to really speak to the audience. What do you think that, as from what you've seen in the field, from where you live, and with the situation, what is something that you hope that more people will understand and come to embrace when it comes to wildlife and such?
I think we need to let go of this idea that we are the CEOs of the planet. And we're not going to change from being bad CEOs to good CEOs. So when we started off by saying, oh, you know, we are in charge of the planet, we are the only species that matter, the only creatures that matter on this planet, therefore we can exploit it and do whatever we want. And now we're saying, oh no, we are the CEOs of the planet. We are going to protect it and sustain it and make sure that it is healthy and well. But in either case, we're essentially taking the role of the big bosses that are in charge of controlling and navigating everything. No one has appointed us to this job other than ourselves. We're not good at this job. No one's interested in us having this job. And it's not a fun job. There is nothing really in it for us either, other than death and despair. If, on the other hand, we step off this managerial seat that we've created for ourselves and regard ourselves as animals among animals, we're no more, no less important than anyone else. We are just as wonderful as wild donkeys, and they are just as wonderful as kangaroos and koalas, and just as wonderful as eucalyptus trees. What we can learn to do is to be good friends to whoever we live amongst. And as long as we're doing that, I think we're going to be okay. We're going to start getting into trouble whenever we try to become the superheroes or the supervillains of whatever story. We're not going to save nature by controlling it. We are nature. And if there's one thing that nature abhors, is control. It is a living, dynamic, infinitely complex system full of creatures that have their own minds, their own interests, and their own lives. Killing these donkeys is not only a terrible crime for these sentient animals, these beautiful animals who have lives of their own, and killing anyone for no good reason. Killing anyone is a tragedy, and certainly doing it for some managerial purpose without even looking at the beauty that they contribute to the world, at the fact that they are simply living beings, and they deserve the same kind of respect that we would want to receive ourselves. I think a campaign to protect the donkeys of Kachana can have extremely powerful influences, not just on these donkeys themselves, but how we think about our place in the world.
not have said it better myself. Thank you so much for making all these wonderful points. I do hope that, and I do think it will resonate with a lot of people, and at least help us to critically think about these situations, and not just accept the first fact that's given to us, facts, if you will. Just because something seems like one way doesn't mean it is that, right? We have to look deeper. And if this campaign doesn't do anything else, I really hope it does show people that we have to pay attention to the details, wherever they may be, in every corner of the globe. So yes, thank you again for spending time with me and spreading awareness. You're doing amazing work, and yeah, you're just the best.
Thank you very, very much. And thank you for your work too, and for the listeners.